So today we're going to do chapters 17 and 18, roughly half of Jehoshaphat's reign. And since we have so much ground to cover, I'm mostly going to just kind of summarize chapter 17. So chapter 17 mostly describes Jehoshaphat's commitment to following the ways of the Lord. He establishes his kingdom and becomes wealthy. He also sends teachers and Levites throughout the kingdom to instruct the people in the ways of the Lord. In short, the chapter highlights God's favor upon Jehoshaphat and the prosperity of his reign as a result of that faithfulness. Now, he's going to squander that rather quickly in an ill-advised alliance with Ahab, the king of the north, in chapter 18. But let's just start taking apart this chapter. Now, again, as was the case in some of the previous videos, I'm not going to go through most of the notes. Again, when we're done, I'll make the notes available, and I'll also timestamp things so you can jump around the video if you're interested in one area. But to begin here, just to kind of get a lay of the land, Dillard in his commentary points out a number of correlations between the portrayal of Asa's reign and his son Jehoshaphat. And so, for example, we have this similar structure where you have reform, construction, the establishment of a strong army, a battle, then additional reforms, another battle, and then transgressions and death. That's roughly the reign of both of them. In fact, down here, Lightheart has a nice chiastic structure to Jehoshaphat's reign. So this would be the entirety of his reign. And Lightheart writes, like the reign of Asa before him, Jehoshaphat's reign is organized around two wars that contrast with one another. So remember last time, Asa had exactly the same kind of structured reign. He responded positively, in another case, responded negatively to the war in front of him. Similarly, Jehoshaphat is going to begin here fortifying, seeking Yahweh. He appoints teachers, receives tribute, and then is going to join Ahab in this war. And this is actually what we're going to cover today, the ground we're going to cover, but continuing, matching the fortification and seeking Yahweh, he's going to have a message from a prophet telling him, do not help the wicked. Instead, seek Yahweh. So that this is in the aftermath of this ill-advised war. Then Jehoshaphat's going to appoint judges, mirroring the appointment of teachers in B over here. And then you're going to have these wars, again, mirroring each other and the responses to these wars. Except this is reversed. In the case of Asa, he responded positively and then negatively. Here, Jehoshaphat has a negative response to the war, and then here is going to have a more positive response in C prime. And then again, another message from a prophet. This time Yahweh destroys the ships because Jehoshaphat allies with Ahab's son. So kind of an up and down reign from Jehoshaphat. And so let's go ahead and just start taking a look at this. So verse 1, Jehoshaphat, his son, reigned in his place and strengthened himself against Israel. This is actually very noteworthy. The commentaries spend a lot of time on this preposition. If you're curious, leave a comment or something. I can talk about it. But it's odd because it could be translated either over Israel or against Israel, which results in two very different meanings or understandings of what's going on in this verse. So the commentaries actually spend a lot of time here, but they almost all conclude there really is no slam dunk argument because there are great arguments for both sides of how this should be translated. What I find interesting is that this same verb, the strengthen language, which is very common, but this with this preposition, the way it's used, this exact construction is only used in the first verse of 2 Chronicles of Solomon. So you have that there and here. So I wonder if it's not like a literary thing to hook back to the first verse of 2 Chronicles. Why exactly he would do that, I don't know. But otherwise, it is very odd. But again, there's a lot of ink spilt on that discussion. But we'll just move on here. And so Jehoshaphat's going to fortify the cities, set garrisons to the land. And the Lord is with Jehoshaphat because he walked in the ways of his father David. And here, of course, we have this Emmanuel type language, the with, God and the Lord with the king. And he, that is Jehoshaphat, did not seek the Baals. This is interesting because, of course, he is contemporary to the north. Ahab and, of course, his wife Jezebel were notorious for seeking after the Baals. And so implicitly here, he's being juxtaposed with Ahab. But Jehoshaphat is seeking the Lord. Of course, this is one of our key terms. Therefore, the Lord established the kingdom in his hand. Of course, this establishment language is also one of our key terms. And all Judah brought tribute to Jehoshaphat, and he had great riches and honor. This is an important concept here. First off, this tribute, mincha, is this is the only time, as who is this? Klein points out here that this is the only place in Chronicles where people bring tribute to their own king, unless the people who bring presents to Hezekiah are also his own subjects. But the point is, this is actually pretty rare. It's a rare honor bestowed on Jehoshaphat. But kind of more importantly here is this idea that he had great riches and honor, because this is going to hook to the first verse of chapter 18. And it'll become important because, as Williamson writes here, that he's pointing out that there are these connections between these two verses. And he says his culpability in an alliance by marriage with Ahab, and then by being impressed by Ahab's show of wealth into going with him into battle, both peculiar to Chronicles, is thus increased and underlined. So the point is, he had his own money and wealth and honor that the Lord had given to him because of his faithfulness. So he had no need to seek those things out with a marriage alliance with Ahab. So that makes him even more culpable because the Lord had already blessed him. And then here in verse 6, his heart was courageous in the ways of the Lord, and furthermore, he took the high places and the Asherim out of Judah. And it should be noted, actually, that this term right here, this could very well and often is translated as again. And so it could be translated, and again, he took the high places and the Asherim out of Judah. And this kind of gets into a nuts and bolts issue. So I kind of want to talk about this, but I'll timestamp so you can jump ahead if you don't care too much about this. But the interest is in how these verses sometimes will conflict. Sometimes you have statement A and then statement B seem to be in conflict with each other. And this is one of those. And Johnstone has, I think, some good comments about this kind of thing. So he says, it is done again, despite Asa's reforming measure in 2 Chronicles 14, verses 3 and 5. Reformation is evidently not a once and for all achievement. It has to be done continually, redone, and becomes an index of the commitment of the Davidic king of the day. And then he launches into a sidebar discussion here. He says, this statement of Jehoshaphat's reforms stands in some tension with 2 Chronicles 20:33. This provides a good example of how evaluative comments in framework elements are not to be taken absolutely at face value, but are modified by Chronicles' overall presentation. In Jehoshaphat's case, that presentation is more complicated than the two-part narrative of the reign in question that has broadly prevailed up till now in 2 Chronicles chapters 10 through 16. The positive evaluation of 2 Chronicles 17 is continued in 2 Chronicles 19:1 through 20:30. The negative in 2 Chronicles 18 is resumed in 2 Chronicles 20:31 through 37. But this footnote here, he has a reference to the introduction to his commentary. And so Johnstone wrote this in the introduction. As far as evaluation is concerned, and what he's referring to here is how often you have these, as he calls them, evaluations, where we get some kind of very short one-verse summary of the king. He says, as far as this is concerned, these narratives need to be read in their entirety. The introductory framework element taken by itself can be misleading. Reigns may seem, at first sight, to be unreservedly commended in formal evaluation. In the parent text in Kings, a qualification is introduced immediately by the adverb only, or however, or something like that. Chronicles may delay the introduction of the qualification and may omit the adverb when he does introduce the qualification, so that he can present his narrative materials on the reigns in two, sometimes more parts, one justifying approval, the other disapproval. And so if you've ever seen a movie that has like a circular narrative structure, or it is like jumping back and forth in time, I've actually heard that. I haven't seen the movie, but Oppenheimer, I've heard, does this, where you have a conversation that's going on and it's kind of jumping back and forth in time, and you're getting cuts back to this conversation, and it really isn't until the end of the movie that you get the full context of the conversation, and that recontextualizes everything. And so the chronicler does that kind of thing, where it's like you have to have the entire structure in mind before you can understand some of these statements. So if you just read verse 6 by itself, it would seem like, well, Jehoshaphat was this smashing success. Everything was great. Well, it's like, well, not really. But the chronicler he kind of cuts and moves things around to suit his narrative purposes. But anyway, I figured I'd throw that in there because you will get this kind of thing in Chronicles. And so it's important to understand that, why you sometimes have that seemingly blatant tension between verses. But continuing on, verse 7, in the third year of his reign, he sent officials, and he's also going to send Levites, and with the Levites, priests. But what's of note here is the third year of his reign, because many commentators believe that, because remember, Asa was diseased late in his life, in his reign. They believe that Jehoshaphat was probably co-reigning with him. And so this third year may actually be Jehoshaphat's first year of solo reign. And when he has full control of the kingdom, he launches into this Reformation project where he's going to send priests and teachers, officials, to go and teach through the lands. And they taught in Judah, having the book of the law of the Lord with them. And they went about through all the cities of Judah and taught among the people. Dillard has an interesting comment here about this phrase, the book of the law of the Lord. The other commentators also are going to note, obviously this is interesting, but nobody really knows exactly what it would have contained. Like, how much of what we consider the Bible did they have, and what are we talking about exactly? But Dillard says, at the very least, however, presuming the historical worth of the material, this pericope does attest to the early existence of authoritative writings regulative of Israel's life, i.e., it speaks of the concept of canonical writings at a time far earlier than critical reconstructions have ordinarily allowed. So I thought that was rather interesting, that it does seem like there is some kind of core canon already, and they're teaching out of this. Whether it was simply the Pentateuch or something more, who knows? My guess is it would have also contained the Davidic Psalms as well as Solomon, stuff like that. And then in verse 10, the fear of the Lord falls upon the kingdoms of the lands that were around Judah, and they made no war against Jehoshaphat. This fear of the Lord language is interesting because it actually does connect back to David as well as Asa. And this really does seem to be some of the peaks of the kingdom where the surrounding nations are recognizing the Lord and the king, in this case Jehoshaphat. And so some of the Philistines brought Jehoshaphat presents, and it's literally tribute, which of course mirrors earlier the people bringing Jehoshaphat tribute, as well as the Arabians who brought 7,700 rams and the same number of goats. In Johnstone commenting on this, he says, the rendering by Israel of every duty to God as sovereign through his designated king prompts the recognition of that sovereignty among the nations round about. Awe falls on all the kingdoms of the lands. They too bring their tribute. Peace between the nations and Israel is thus established. This is the ideal role of the Davidic monarch ruling in Jerusalem, and that is the ideal which Jehoshaphat should have maintained. Of course, contrast the next chapter. In verse 12, and Jehoshaphat grew steadily greater, and he's going to build more fortresses, storage cities, and large supplies. This language is, of course, interesting because this, once again, is going to pun on maal. So the sacrilege language, maal. And as you note here, it's a homonym. So if I were to click out to this word, you have Jehoshaphat growing greater, steadily greater, above, exceedingly. Of course, if I look at the other term, spelled exactly the same way, you have treachery, trespass, falsehood. And so in obedience, they're being elevated. Of course, in disobedience, it's this great trespass. But this is a pun we've seen with some of the kings. I think David and Solomon specifically had this pun used of them. So because they didn't commit a maal, they are elevated. And it should probably be noted here, you have Judah as well as Benjamin. And as Johnstone's going to point out, once again, it is to be noted that Judah and Benjamin provide the outer framework of the ideal people. We've already seen this ever since the schism, since the North and the South have split. We have this remnant left over, but that remnant is mirroring the genealogical sections where we had the royal tribes, Judah and Benjamin, at the edges, with the Levites in the center. And so we're still having that same structure. And now moving down in chapter 18, we have this linking phrase which went into verse 5 of chapter 17. Now Jehoshaphat had great riches and honor, and he made a marriage alliance with Ahab. After some years, he went down to Ahab in Samaria, and Ahab killed an abundance of sheep and oxen for him and for the people who were with him, and induced him to go up against Ramoth Gilead. Of course, we dealt with this in the last chapter. Jehoshaphat already had great riches and honor, so he did not need to make this alliance, but he does. And it's very ill-advised, as Johnstone's going to point out, that this alliance by marriage is through the marriage of Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram, and Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and his wife, Jezebel, the princess from Sidon in Lebanon. The lethal effects of that marriage are to be seen when Athaliah eventually becomes queen mother in Judah and uses that position to try to wipe out the Davidic dynasty, as 2 Chronicles 22 through 23:15 is about to tell. So very shortly, this marriage alliance is going to yield some very negative effects. And it's worth noting here in verse 2, Ahab kills an abundance of sheep and oxen, but this is actually sacrificial terminology. This is a worship, liturgical kind of act. And so once again, Jehoshaphat should not be a part of this. And concerning also this went down language, when we dealt with Rehoboam, I followed Johnstone, who made the argument that Rehoboam should have never left Jerusalem to go down to the northern side at Shechem. And he listed a number of cases where it's a mistake for the king to leave Jerusalem. And this is one of those examples. So Johnstone writes in his commentary, Jehoshaphat went down to Samaria, the new capital of the north. As elsewhere in Chronicles, especially in the case of Rehoboam, the departure of the sole accredited king of Israel from the sole recognized capital, Jerusalem, is the signal for a disastrous turn of events. Chronicles adds to Samaria to the parent text to make the point unambiguous. The indiscretion is compounded. Not only does he, the legitimate king of Israel, deem it appropriate to leave Jerusalem to go parley with the son of a usurper of the throne of a country which by right belongs to himself, he even treats it as an equal by allying himself to it by marriage. Even worse, he thereby introduces a foreign poison into the system of his own kingdom. But it's even worse because not only is he allying himself with Ahab, it's really actually not even as an equal. As we'll see in this story, Jehoshaphat is actually seemingly the subordinate here. And so this is a massive mistake by Jehoshaphat. And for now, we'll move over this induced language because it's going to become important, because virtually every commentator is going to note this language because it links back to 1 Chronicles 21, the first verse of that. But I have a bit to say about that, so we'll hold that off for later. We'll move down to verse 4 and following. Jehoshaphat has agreed to go with Ahab into war, but he first wants to inquire of the word of the Lord. And this is actually our Sikh language. This is what a good king should do. So he's at least doing that much. And then the king of Israel, Ahab, gathered the prophets together, 400 men, and he said to them, "Shall we go to battle against Ramoth Gilead, or shall I refrain?" And they said, "Go up, for God will give it into the hand of the king." But Jehoshaphat said, "Is there not here another prophet of the Lord of whom we may inquire?" And this is actually funny because another is actually not in the Hebrew. So he asks to hear the word of the Lord. They come in and they actually say Elohim. They actually don't invoke the divine name. They all say the same thing. You're going to win. Go for it. And so, again, literally, because it lacks another, he says, "Is there not here a prophet of the Lord whom we may inquire?" So it's almost like he asks the question again. Are we sure there's not somebody here? And I really like this note by Dillard. He says, one criterion by which the true prophet was recognized in the Old Testament was that he, in his preaching, often stood alone, running against the tide of the popular expectation. His opposition to the vox populi, became a hallmark of the true prophet. The vox populi and the vox pseudo-prophetae were all but identical. So that agreement with the popular consensus made the prophetic message suspicious at the outset. So the fact that they're all agreeing is very suspicious. Such suspicion appears to underlie Jehoshaphat's awareness that he was yet to hear the word of Yahweh. So he knows something's up because they're all saying the same thing. In verse 7, Ahab says to Jehoshaphat, "There is yet one man by whom we may inquire of the Lord, Micaiah the son of Imlah. But I hate him, for he never prophesies good concerning me, but always evil." I wish they had translated this as disaster, because we'll see as we move along in the narrative. It is kind of funny, though, because in this, it seems almost a tacit admission by Ahab that indeed they have not yet heard from the Lord. But I like what John Stone says here about Micaiah. He says that Ahab is loth to consult him because he habitually prophesies disaster for him. Evil, the opposite of good, already defined as the intended quality of life for the Lord's people. How can it be otherwise? Ahab is the king of a schismatic and apostate state that is devoid of theological legitimacy. A prophet of the Lord has no option but to adopt a stance of consistent opposition. And so Jehoshaphat insists that they go ahead and bring him out. So they summon for him, bring quickly Micaiah. And in verse 9, now the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, were sitting on their thrones, arrayed in their robes, and they were sitting at the threshing floor at the entrance of the gate of Samaria, and all the prophets were prophesying before them. And many commentators think that this may have been some kind of like ecstasy state, right? They're, who knows, writhing around on the floor. If they're prophets of Baal, actually, maybe they're like cutting themselves or something. But there's a couple things worth noting here, and one of these is, I think, very interesting. So Klein says, the enthronement of the two kings by the threshing floor at the gates of Samaria is in ironic contrast to the enthronement of Yahweh in verse 18 and to the frenzied activity of the prophets here. So his point being, we're going to get an image of the divine council, this orderly procession, whereas here there's this frenzied activity. And again, once we learn that actually these prophets are delusional, but they've been given up over to this delusion by God, we have this ironic contrast between this scene, this human council scene, and the divine council scene is what it's getting at. And also the royal garments, the royal robes worn at the safe haven of Samaria are in contrast to the disguise that Ahab dons in verse 29. And I'll have something to say about that as well, because there's something interesting going on there as well. The threshing floor would provide an open space before the city gate and may have been considered a sacred space where prophesying would be appropriate. I have a video on my channel where I go through some articles and things like that about threshing floor symbology. I'd encourage you to check it out. The threshing floor is basically this site of testing and even judgment. It's this liminal realm where the human and the divine often meet. So there's a lot going on there. And of course, even in Chronicles, we've had these. One of those episodes is 1 Chronicles 21, where David takes the census. And the angel of the Lord is going to stand over the threshing floor site. It's going to become the future temple site. It was also the site where Abraham nearly sacrifices his son, Isaac. Of course, David's other failure, when they tried to move the ark illegitimately. And Uzzah dies at that site. It's at a threshing floor. So we've already encountered threshing floors in Chronicles, and they often have this portentous feel to them. Something bad may happen if you're not being careful with how you're treating the divine. Are you listening to the Lord or not? But continuing with Klein, he says, Jones, on the other hand, points to some other passages where, and this term is gorin, which is threshing floor, what's translated as threshing floor, may refer to an empty space with a rock or earth floor that was not used specifically for an agricultural purpose. He concludes that this refers to an open public place at the gate of the city rather than a threshing floor. Now, I think it's almost a distinction without a difference in a way, in that, because I want to say I brought this up in that video, the threshing floor video, but I think this might be almost like what we get with, there's a lot of modern examples. Usually technology has these where, let's say you hang up the phone. Today, that means you just press a button. but we still use that language because it referred to a time when you actually hung up a receiver. Similarly, I think this open space with this rock or stone floor I think they were called threshing floor sites, even if they weren't actually threshing wheat at the site. But this footnote is actually very interesting. Sidney Smith marshals evidence that there was a threshing floor at some city gates. This setting may have been chosen for a kind of legal trial between the court prophets and Micaiah. That's very interesting because that almost then gives this a feel kind of like Jesus' trial, where he is on trial, but in reality, he's not. He's actually the judge, and they're the ones that are on trial. Similarly, it seems as if this is the case, they're bringing Micaiah out to try him. However, it's actually Ahab that has been judged, not by Micaiah, but by God, by the divine council. And the verdict has already come down. Just a very interesting idea. And so the prophets are prophesying, and Zedekiah, the son of Chinanah, made for himself horns of iron and said, "Thus says the Lord, with these you shall push the Syrians until they are destroyed." And all the prophets prophesied so and said, "Go up to Ramoth Gilead and triumph. The Lord will give it into the hand of the king." And this is interesting because Zedekiah here, it either means the Lord is righteous, Yahweh is righteous, or Johnstone has something different. He says, "The Lord is my victory." But Johnstone says, by his name, Zedekiah is a would-be prophet of the Lord, and he does not scruple to use the name of the Lord as authority for his word. But he is in the mold of the traditional prophets of Canaan, and that's actually what it has here, son of Chinanah. This is son of Canaan is what it means. He sports a pair of iron horns to represent invincible might, as of the bull, the traditional symbol of the supreme deity of the Canaanites. That is, the cosmic power through which Ahab should gore his enemies into annihilation. And so this guy is seemingly some kind of syncretic prophet. He may invoke the name of the Lord, but he is incorporating elements of Canaanite religion. I think specifically here El, because El was the maybe not father of Baal, and El often had this bull symbolism used. Of course, you have the golden calf, similar kind of themes going on there. So this prophet, not a true prophet of the Lord, says, "Go up, you're going to be victorious." And so a messenger goes and gets Micaiah and is saying, "Hey, look, everybody's saying the same thing. Let your word be like one of them. Speak favorably." But Micaiah says, "As the Lord lives, for what my God says, that I will speak." And so they ask Micaiah the same question, "Shall we go up? Shall we refrain?" Micaiah says, "Go up and triumph. They will be given into your hand." But the king said to him, "How many times shall I make you swear that you speak to me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" So something about his answer tips him off that he's being sarcastic or something. And so Micaiah then says, "I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains, as sheep that have no shepherd. And the Lord said, these have no master. Let each return to his home in peace." And this actually becomes kind of the theme of the dueling words of the prophets and the king. In verse 17, "And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, did I not tell you that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil?" And Micaiah said, "Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, the king of Israel, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?" And one said one thing, another said another. Then the Spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, "I will entice him." And the Lord said to him, "By what means?" And he said, "I will go out, and I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all the prophets." And he said, "You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster concerning you." And it is the term used before about what he always declares for Ahab. In these other cases translated as evil, but it's actually here the word disaster. And what's interesting is actually, I don't know if you can see it very well, but here in orange, this is the word order. So literally it would be something like, the Lord declared concerning you disaster. So it ends on this note of disaster. And concerning some of this divine counsel stuff, Dillard says, preeminently the prophet was to be a man possessed by the Spirit, His message derived from his access to the heavenly council to hear the words of God. Both the possession of the Spirit and the heavenly council figure in the debate over true prophecy in the Micaiah narrative. The prophet's message was not to be in the name of other gods or to contradict previous revelation. It's going to give off some additional criteria for the prophets. But I want to get to this next point because this is really important here. Dillard picks up in his commentary, page 253 and 54, he says, the role of the heavenly council in Israel's warfare was ordinarily the mustering of the heavenly army to fight in Israel's behalf, rousing even the forces of the cosmos to join the divine warrior in a joint venture with the nation against the enemies of God. And here he cites a number of places, as well as this article, which I will make available on Ko-Fi. We've actually seen this in like First Chronicles, for instance. There was one particular episode, I'm forgetting which chapter, but it was with David, and it specifically has the phrase about where they were supposed to go out when they heard the sound of marching on top of the balsam trees. And some of the commentators note, well, actually all of them note how obscure and strange that is. Nobody really knows what to do with it, other than many pointing out they believe this is some form of the divine council intervening in this battle, in this conflict in some way. So normally that's what you get. When you have a faithful Israel, the Lord with his heavenly host is doing battle with the nation of Israel against the enemies of God. Here, the divine council is actually being used against Israel because they're in apostasy. And so Dillard continues, here, however, that customary role is reversed. The heavenly council devises the death of Ahab and the defeat of Israel's armies. This section of the Micaiah narrative gives graphic expression to the claim of the later canonical prophets that the false prophets were speaking lies. And here he has a number of references. For delusion as a motif of divine punishment, compare a number of New Testament passages here. And this is, I think, is really important to the narrative, which we'll loop back to. So keep this in mind, that delusion is part of divine punishment. And worth noting here is this language of who will entice Ahab, because this looks an awful lot like what you get in Proverbs 1, roughly 31, 30, somewhere in that range, because you're going to have this entice language used in an adjectival sense. So here in verse 32, as I click on it, for the simple. So this simpleton person, right, they're killed by their turning away, and their complacency of fools destroys them. But whoever listens to me, so whoever shamas, the Lord will dwell secure, and he will be at ease without dread of disaster. There you are with that term again. So Ahab is a simpleton who is turned away by the words of his prophets. They give him what he wants to hear, and that leads him straight to the path of disaster. Of course, he doesn't hear. He doesn't listen to the words. Again, you have Micaiah saying, therefore, hear the word of the Lord. He has the word of the Lord in front of him, but he rejects it. And so after Micaiah delivers this prophecy, Zedekiah, again, son of Canaan, comes near and strikes Micaiah on the cheek and says, which way did the Spirit of the Lord go from me to speak to you? And Micaiah said, behold, you shall see on that day when you go into an inner chamber to hide yourself. And this is actually super cryptic. Nobody really knows what to do with this. Klein says, Micaiah's answer is obscure or at least indirect. It apparently means that Zedekiah will have to acknowledge Micaiah's authority when in the future he has to hide out from military disaster. I wish I could spend more time on this, like searching it up, because like I said, it's very obscure. And then the king, Ahab, says, seize him, send him to prison, feed him with meager rations of bread and water until I return in peace. So there we are again with this language of peace. And Micaiah says, if you return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me. And he said, hear all you peoples. And so Johnstone writes here that Ahab's boast that Micaiah is to be held in custody until I return in peace exactly matches Micaiah's words. Let each one return to his house in peace. Back in verse 16. The critical matter is peace and how to attain it. For Micaiah, it can only be by the way of truly seeking the Lord in all things, not by the charade of Ahab and Jehoshaphat, who are attempting to elevate the human desires of an illegitimate regime into God's will. I love the way he puts that, because they're trying to say, hey, look, we went to the prophets and they said, let's do this thing. But of course, it's a charade. And they're trying to elevate this to the level of this is God's will. The gauntlet has been thrown down, and it's, will Ahab return in peace or not? Because that's going to determine this trial. Again, remember, if this is the case, that this is basically a trial, the guilt or innocence of Micaiah is riding on this. Does Ahab return in peace or not? And then you have this line here, all you peoples. And there's debate about this, as far as the forelage, all of that stuff. But what's interesting is this actually mirrors basically exactly Micah. So after we have the introduction about who he is, the days he spoke, but you have, hear you peoples, all of you, which is, many people think it's a callback to this. And then spoiler alert here with this heading. But they go into battle. Now here we're going to hit some really interesting things that I want to talk about. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, went up to Ramoth Gilead. And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I will disguise myself and go into battle, but you wear your robes. And the king of Israel disguised himself, and they went into battle. Now this is why I said earlier that this was even worse than being an ally, because they're not equals. Here, he's painting a giant target on Jehoshaphat's back, and Jehoshaphat goes along with it. It seems like almost like he has no other choice, in the sense that he's at the power disadvantage. And so he goes along with this. And verse 30 tells us why this is a terrible decision, because the king of Syria had commanded the captain of his chariots, fight with neither small nor great, but only with the king of Israel. And so this is something I do all the time in Rome Total War. With some of your best troops, you are going to ignore other people, but you just try to zero in on the king, on the general. Because if you can defeat them, the rest of the army will be demoralized and become easier to rout. And so they're trying to, with his chariots, he's trying to take care of the king. And as soon as the captains of the chariots saw Jehoshaphat, they said, it is the king of Israel. And so they turned to fight against him. And Jehoshaphat cried out, and the Lord helped him, and he drew them away from him. Now, there's so much stuff going on here. First off, this narrative has many echoes to battles before and after it. In 1 Chronicles 10, a chapter that itself echoed other battles, we read about Saul's death at the hand of the Philistines. In that video, commenting on the emphasis of Saul's armor, I mentioned a motif that runs throughout 1 Samuel, where Saul is often losing clothes. Like David is cutting off a piece of his clothes, things like that. And I went on to mention the interesting language of 1 Samuel 28. This is the chapter where Saul resorts to the medium at Endor. And so we read down here in verse 8, so Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him. Of course, this disguise language is exactly what's going on here in Chronicles. So superficially, we have the theme of a king disguising himself in other clothes, but there's deeper themes lurking in the subtext. To disguise himself, Saul removes his royal robes and puts on other garments, bagadim. Symbolically here, his kingship is being removed by his own actions. Remember, according to Chronicles, this is the maal that finally breaks him. Solidifying the point, the term for garments, the root, beged, does generically refer to clothing. However, it is a homonym. An English example of a homonym would be a word like bank. Is that a river bank, or is it the financial building you put your money in? A clever writer might fuse both meanings, like a bank flowing with money, for example. Well, here, this root, bet gimel dalet, means clothing, but it also forms the word for treachery. So we have Saul exchanging his royalty with treachery. Here in 2 Chronicles, Ahab disguises himself, and he has Jehoshaphat wear his robes. Of course, again, this is our term here, the same BGD root. So again, if we're thinking like theologically and we connect this back to Samuel and the Samuel narratives and themes, what he's doing here is he's forcing Jehoshaphat into this treachery, into this disobedient act or whatever. And while it initially works, they pursue him, and then Jehoshaphat cries out to the Lord, which of course mirrors other crying out, which is kind of funny, this highlighted here, where the woman sees Samuel and cries out. But it mirrors the crying out of, like, for instance, the crossing of the Red Sea, where people cry out to the Lord for deliverance. So he cries out to the Lord, and the Lord helped him. Again, one of our key terms throughout Chronicles, where the Lord helps those who resort to him. And God drew them away, the enemy away from him. And so when the enemy sees him, they turn back from pursuing him. And of course, this turning back language is going to look forward to Jehoshaphat returning in safety, which of course goes back all the way to Micaiah's prophecy about who will return in safety or not, and that kind of thing. That's Micaiah's whole prophecy is hinging on that. Well, the enemy turns away from him because Jehoshaphat cries out to the Lord. So they turn away, which allows Jehoshaphat to return himself back home in safety. But a certain man drew his bow at random, or literally in his innocence, and he struck the king of Israel between the scale armor and the breastplate. Therefore he said to the driver of his chariot, "Turn around and carry me out of the battle, for I am wounded." And the battle continued that day, and the king of Israel was propped up in his chariot facing the Syrians until evening. Then at sunset he died. Now, once again, we're going to have a lot of vocabulary that's going to create some interesting links to various passages. So we're going to go to 1 Chronicles 21. And remember, I said at the very beginning of this chapter that there was this incitement language that was used of Ahab. Ahab incited Jehoshaphat to go with him. So all the commentaries basically agree that this language takes us back to this section here in Chronicles where, quote unquote, Satan incites David to take the census. Now, if you weren't here for 1 Chronicles 21, you'd have to check out that video for the details. But we argued that there's very good reason to say Satan here in 1 Chronicles 21 is not the devil. There's contextual, grammatical reasons. Again, check out the video for all the full details. But if it's not referencing the devil, then who's opposing David? Well, I think it's the same as the parallel text in 2 Samuel 24. It's God. And using Satan here without the definite article here in 1 Chronicles 21 is a very subtle way of linking to Numbers 22, where the angel of the Lord is referenced as being a Satan, literally an opposer to Balaam. Now, granting that the chronicler is making this subtle connection resolves the so-called contradiction. God is inciting David to take the census in Samuel and in Chronicles. And so, how you interpret 1 Chronicles 21 is going to affect how you interpret this passage here in 2 Chronicles 18. Now, I'm going to disagree with some of the particulars, but Klein here is going to give us a sampling of how this is typically handled. So on page 267, Klein writes, the second clause, God enticed them away from him, or drew them away, however, was probably added by the chronicler, and it makes Yahweh use deceit in this case. This questionable divine behavior may have led to the variant reading in the LXX. He turned them away. So the Greek kind of softens the language. Continuing with Klein, he says, in an apparent effort to exonerate Yahweh of the charge of deceit, see also 1 Chronicles 21:1, where Satan, rather than Yahweh, is made the subject of this verb. This same verb, SWT, is used for Ahab's persuasive efforts to get Jehoshaphat to join his campaign against Ramoth-Gilead. Ahab, the manipulator, met his match in Yahweh. The Arameans did not just turn away from Jehoshaphat of their own volition to go after Ahab. Rather, they were drawn away, again, literally the incited them away language, by a higher power. So this word, again, God literally enticed them away or incited them away. Now, I fundamentally disagree with the idea that Yahweh's behavior here is questionable. Again, this was covered in the chapter 21 video, but it comes down to the concept of pedagogy. God is the father to his son Israel. Israel is represented by one man, the king, who is also the son of God. The father's job is to raise his son, which will require testing and discipline when his son fails. Because I think chapter 21 of 1 Chronicles references the angel of the Lord. I don't think the chronicler is trying to get God off the hook. He sees God's actions as just. David should have trusted God's promises. God inciting the census or deluding the false prophets is only a problem if you assume fatalism. Ahab, for example, heard the true prophet of the Lord. He heard the words of the Lord, but rather than listen to him, he imprisoned him. Ahab continued his rebellion and listened to his own prophets, many who presumably would have been full-blown prophets of Baal. So God is perfectly within his rights to use people's own sinful desires against them as a means of judgment. Earlier, we noted the concept of spiritual delusion as a sign of divine punishment. The Eastern Orthodox, for example, have the concept of prelist, which is essentially spiritual delusion. And so here's what I'm seeing going on in these passages. Similar to 1 Chronicles 21, a king is under judgment. And so that's why we have the incitement vocabulary being used. Where I think the commentators miss the nuance is they see the 1 Chronicles 21 incitement as bad or evil. I think it's morally neutral because it's coming from the Lord. But David responds poorly, which leads to an anti-Passover, as many Israelites are struck down by a plague. And so the incitement language is used here of both kings in chapter 18, negatively of Ahab, who is enticing the Davidic king into an illicit war for Ahab's own gain. Ahab is under judgment from the divine council. He failed every test before him. Jehoshaphat, on the other hand, in the final moment, cries out to the Lord and is delivered. I think the use of this language is exactly in concert with the chronicler's themes so far, to resort to the Lord, to seek the Lord. Here, rather than perish for his mistakes, Jehoshaphat finally resorts to the Lord, and God incites his enemies away from him. And I think much of this episode should also be considered with Daniel, for example. Nebuchadnezzar loses his reason in a decree of the Watchers, also called a decree of the Most High. But again, we have a king judged for his arrogance and the employment of the divine counsel. So to sum up, a spirit of delusion is used on the enemies of God and the so-called prophets of Ahab. Jehoshaphat makes it clear he is not an enemy of God. And so his enemies are manipulated away from harming him. And to finish off with some of the remaining ideas here, we have this language of scale armor and breastplate, which is, it's kind of interesting because in 1 Chronicles 10, which is, again, the death of Saul, you have in verse 2 that the Philistines overtook Saul. And oddly enough, it's the same terminology here. But maybe of more interest here is the breastplate. This particular spelling is only used in the parallel in Kings as well as Isaiah 59:17. But you have another spelling, as you can see here. You have two different spellings. The other spelling of, again, translated here as breastplate, you get with Goliath in 1 Samuel 17:5, which itself is interesting because a lot of people have noted typologically the way Goliath is described with the scale armor and things like that. He's basically described as like a giant snake, a giant reptile, which of course connects him to the serpent in Genesis 3. Obviously the enemy, and of course David is going to destroy him by via the head. He's going to hit him in the head with the slingshot, and then he's going to cut off his head. So it's kind of that messianic foreshadowing of the serpent's head being crushed. And of course, going back to 1 Chronicles 10, you have Saul losing his head. It's taken into the temple of Dagon. And of course, all of that stuff, the temple of Dagon itself, remember Dagon lost his head when they brought the Ark of the Covenant. We went into some of this typological stuff. There's a lot of typological things going on between Goliath and that chapter. And so this might also be a callback to all of those connections as well. So we should probably keep that kind of stuff in mind. And I like this as a concluding note by Johnstone. He writes, human fortitude counts for nothing, and is referring to the fact that the king propped himself up. He's more, as he puts it, it's more resolute than in Kings. So he's, through sheer effort, lifting himself back up. But theologically, the fate of Ahab, misguided through his own folly as he is, however brave he be, is inescapable. With great pathos, Chronicles records the death of the king of Israel at sunset. The day of battle ends with the end of the reign of the impotent king. The chaotic powers of the world of the nations have destroyed the leader of the illegitimate Israelite regime. And that illegitimacy is a big reason why this was such a mistake for Jehoshaphat to ally himself with them. But in his final moments, he had a choice, and he resorted to the Lord. He cries out to the Lord. He is delivered. And next time we'll pick up with chapter 19, maybe 19 and 20. I'm not sure. And I will see you guys then.